Yeah, all good. All good. Good evening. It's a nice, peaceful evening here. Nice spring evening, roughly 8ish in the evening. Been for a couple of laps to bike around, and I was doing a bit of reflecting on a question I've been asked on several occasions around comparing fitness testing normative data between Australian NPL footballers and non-league footballers in England. Now, it's quite a generalised question. I'm going to give my take on it anecdotally based on my experiences, and I'm going to try and simplify it best I can. Obviously going to have different individuals that are going to be outside these kind of norms, but I'm going to base these around generally NPL in New South Wales, the tier 1, 2 and 3. I know that it was brought to my attention actually the other day that it's not called NPL 1, 2 and 3 now. A few years ago they sort of changed the name again, but for simplicity let's stay with the tier 1, 2 and 3 in State League and focus on New South Wales because that's most of my experience is based out of New South Wales. My experience, I sort of played in the State League from 91 to 95. It shows how old I am. So that was the State League. It was called the State League. That eventually would become the NPL League, and now sort of, I believe it's sort of changed name again. So let's sort of focus on New South Wales and think about sort of the NPL, 1, 2 and 3 as it was sort of, called up until the last few years. The old State League, for those of you old enough to remember. Okay, we'll focus on that. In England, we'll focus on tier 6 to 10, steps 2 to 6. And the reason being because tier 5, the National Conference League, a lot of the teams and players are professional there. And once you sort of start going to professional data and details, it kind of skews the results really. So I'm going to sort of focus on. So I'm going to focus on the sort of tier 1, 2, and 3. And you could argue that, New South Wales, along with probably Victoria, debatably is the sort of strongest state in terms of football. So it's probably going to apply there and thereabouts to the other states also. So with the exception, we'll take out the National Conference in the UK because obviously that sort of tier 5. For the most part, a lot of the players are professional. So if we look at some of the details, I'm going to base these details on my own sort of experience playing in the old State League, 91-ish to 95-ish, what was then afterwards called the NPL. So we'll focus on that sort of like the free leagues in the state, around that sort of level. Semi-pro, part-time, got jobs, go to uni type thing. And I also have the experience of playing non-league in England, 95 to 97. And I've also worked with individual players, not just professionally in England, and I've also worked with non-league players too. And my experience of working with sort of bake-up semi-pro team from 211 to 213. 218 to 24. So I'm not going to include the normative data of professional players I've worked with and professional team I've worked with. That's going to put that to one side too. Going to focus predominantly on tier 6 to 10 in the UK. And you could argue there is a bit of there is transparency between tier 6 and 10, steps 2 to 6 in England. But if we sort of group that together for simplicity, even though there is transparency, but like we've seen in different trophies and cup competitions, step 6 can compete against step 2, tier 6 to 10, more than competitive. So just for simplicity, we'll sort of focus on that. So we sort of focus on that. I would say based on my experience and the data I've gathered over the years, it hasn't really changed much, to be honest. From say the mid to late 90s to now. I mean, I've sort of carried on predominantly working on Zoom, doing well-being and mental prep coaching with the Australasian Soccer Academy. and some of the players there play NPL and the leagues under the NPL, like what's called League 1 and 2 NPL. So yeah, there is that to sort of take into consideration. And there has been players from the Australian Soccer Academy that have come over to the UK. And a couple of years ago, I think it was one player who played, I think, NPL level and was doing some training out in the UK with a professional team, but also was doing some training with a semi-pro team, Radcliffe, and young player more than held his own with the all-age team. More than held his own with the all-age team physical fitness. More than held his own. And I did some fitness testing with him as well. Albeit, I've sort of moved away from sort of the fitness coaching a long time ago, more into performance coaching. I still have a keen interest in that area. But I would say personally, and I'm not giving advice and making suggestions, and it's only like my own sort of sample size. I would say there are a lot of similarities between the T1, 2 and 3 in New South Wales, the NPL and the old NPL 1 and 2, and say step 2 and 6 in the UK, T6 and 10. 10 metre sprint, I would say you're looking at around about, say, 1.57, 1.59. Both the Australian New South Wales NPL leagues and the Tier 6 to 10, albeit, you could argue in England as well, even Tier 6 on the players are pro and may have recently been sort of pro and have sort of come down to that level, going to be sort of, slightly a little bit high in some of these tests. But I would say the sprint, pretty similar. 20 metre sprint, about 299. NPL, about 299, 295. Non-league in England. So remember, when I'm referring to NPL, I'm also referring to the 1, 2 and 3 tier in New South Wales. I'm referring to non-league in England. I'm referring to tier 6 to 10, steps 2 to 6 predominantly, so to speak. The yo-yo one, probably similar, about 1,800 metres to 2,100 metres, about the same as well. VO2 max, I would say, about 50 to 55. You're going to have some slightly higher exceptions to the rule. You're going to have some, not many going to be slightly lower, so to speak. But yeah, that sits around there. So that's sort of anecdotally, sort of reflecting on some of the data I collected over the years, based on my own sort of experiences. That might sort of be different, and that's obviously a small sample size, so to speak. But I don't think there's a great deal of difference with the normative data. I think where it is different is translating that data. I mean, you could always question the reliability and validity in regards to football, but there is some reliability and validity there. It is useful to a certain extent, but I think sort of translating that data, albeit the data might be similar, I think where the players, NPL players, would struggle and do struggle based on my anecdotal experience in the UK, in England I should say, non-league, is the pace of the game and the relentless nature of the 50, 60 games, if you include sometimes cup competitions in the non-league in England, whereas you don't have as many games in the NPL in Australia, in Sydney. So that's a huge thing, I think. So that, I think, would affect the output from a physical perspective. What these tests probably don't take into consideration is the kind of distance and intensity covered. So I would sort of argue perhaps the way the game is played in Australia at that level, it's going to be more sort of sprint-based recovery, whereas in England it's going to be more relentless in terms of the pace of the game. The pace of the game, especially when the players are faced with sort of 2 games in the week, even 3 games sometimes. Even, like I mentioned the other week, you have weeks like the Easter weekend where it was even more than that. You know, you had like some teams had games Easter Saturday, Monday, then Wednesday and Saturday again. That's obviously exceptions to the rule, but it does happen. So that's sort of my take on it. So when I sort of refer to NPL, I don't just mean the top tier in the state. I also mean like the first, second, and third tier, which used to be called NPL 1, 2, 3. Up until a few years ago, they kind of changed their name. It used to be the old State League, for those of you back in the day who remember that. When I refer to the non-league in England, I think it's important to specify, I'm sort of saying tier 6 to 10, steps 2, even 3s to 6. But that's my take on it. It'd be great to hear what your take on it is. That's my take on it.